Hi everyone, welcome back to the Enlightenment Now series where we're looking at Steven Pinker's book on the progress humanity has made over the past 250 years. In this episode we're going to be looking at democracy, another success story of modernity. In fact, 200 years ago democracy barely existed. Now it's the main form of state governance across the globe. So how did this happen? That's what we're going to look at, and more importantly, is it now all under threat? Are there more sustainable forms of progress when it comes to creating free and equal societies? So here's the good news, which as usual Steven Pinker dwells on. Today, about 2/3 of the world's population live in free or relatively free societies. And if this seems like too few, well, in 1950 it was less than 2/5 of the world population. In 1900 it was only 1/5. In 1850 only 7% of the world's population lived under democratic rule, and in 1816 it was only 1%. So over the past 200 years, democracy has risen from almost nothing to the leading form of state governance across the world. And this progress is not to be underestimated. Democracies are kind of defined by being less prone to the reigns of terror that governments have inflicted on their citizens throughout history. These are things such as slavery, summary executions, torture, mutilations of dissidents. These sort of things tend to happen much less frequently, if at all, in democratic nations. Democracies also tend to have higher rates of economic growth, fewer wars, genocides, healthier and better educated systems, and, as Pinker points out, virtually no famines. So, by all means, democracy is not it's far from perfect. It's not the best form of government we could ever think of, by all means, but it's clearly better than its predecessors, the feudalistic or autocratic states of history. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that there's all sorts of problems with democracy as a system of government. Are people informed enough to vote rationally? Are democracies truly representative? Is it even fair for the will of the majority to rule over minorities? Now, I'm not going to go into these issues here. I think to make the case that democracy is simply better than everything that came before it is good enough for looking at the progress we've made. What I'm going to assume instead is that we want to continue this trend, but I'm going to look at whether democracy is actually under threat by the very process that enabled its rise. So if you look at the news today, democracy doesn't look perhaps as stable as we would like it to be. You have, over the past decade, the presidency of Donald Trump, you have Brexit in the UK, and you've got populist movements in a number of European nations, in particular Hungary. And the stability of democracy, that is something we used to think as the bedrock of the liberal modern world, is now in doubt. Perhaps the most well-known recent book on this is the political theorist David Runciman's book, How Democracy End. In that he argues democracies don't fall just necessarily due to things that happened in the past, so we shouldn't look back to Nazi Germany or fascist Italy to see what might go wrong again. Instead, they fall due to problems of their own making. And there's been a number of works such as Lawrence Lessig's Republic Lost, or Jane Mayer's Dark Money, and more recently Peter Gauguin's Democracy for Sale, that have shown that modern democracies actually have they suffer from three major problems which we don't yet know can be solved. So what are these? So the first is the problem that there is just increasingly large sums of money involved in democratic politics. So obviously the most common example of this in the United States is how much election campaigns are sponsored by private corporations, private wealth, but also just how corporate and private interests are involved in lobbying, in think tanks, and other forms of influencing political decision making, some of which actually look more like outright corruption. Second problem is related. It's the rise of very wealthy media corporations that have close to a monopoly when it comes to the mainstream media, and that continuously misinform the public through various bias information. And then the third problem is a new one, very much so, social media, which again is run by a few powerful interests, but can be manipulated in various ways to further control and divide public opinion. So all these problems stem from these large concentrations of corporate and private wealth alongside new technological innovations, and this increase in inequality, this mass concentration of wealth, is really something that we've seen since the 1980s onwards. This is about power and its distribution. Writers such as George Monbiot argues that this kind of process has led to democracy in various Western nations, including the UK and the US, to look more like oligarchies than democracies. It's where the state is responding more to the interests of these powerful corporations and individuals rather than the majority of their citizens. So what can be done about these problems? Can they be solved? So on the face of it, these seem like three pretty major problems. But we've seen major problems before in this series that Pinker typically takes in his stride. So we've seen, for example, how industrial agriculture degrades the soil and therefore might not be sustainable in the long run. We've seen how modern lifestyles and diets create new illnesses and disease that plague the lives of millions. We've seen, obviously, climate change, which is an existential threat for all of humanity. Now, typically what Pinker says is, yeah, of course, progress creates new problems. That doesn't mean we haven't made progress, because we can solve these new problems even better than we can before. Now, in this case, when it comes to these problems of democracy, I think Pinker might take that line, and he might have a point. So, for example, Peter Gogegan, in his book Democracy for Sale, and he's a leading journalist at Open Democracy, which I recommend you check out, he says that all of these problems are potentially fixable through new laws and better resource regulators. Which is exactly, what Pinker would say. We just need the same kind of progress, but tweaked so it's even better. But the problem with this leaving things there is that the people who can actually make these regulations, make these new laws, might not have the will to do so. So as Gogegan goes on to note, he says, when talking about Brexit, he says that the referendum and its aftermath revealed that we have a broken political system that is ripe for exploitation again and again and again. He sees not necessarily the political will to turn this tide around. So the existential threat for democracy, if you like, comes from the fact that those who have successfully exploited these inadequacies of the current regulatory system, such as prominent politicians or massive media corporations, they have very little incentive to fix those problems, to fix this system. So another way of putting it is the people with the power to solve these problems are actually the ones who are causing them. So Pinker doesn't really tend to deal with these kind of political issues. He generally thinks that, look, as long as we have the knowledge to solve problems, we eventually will, if they're important enough. But the problem is this assumption of who the we is. That might be true if you're looking at academics who want to try and improve the world, or the majority of citizens who want to live in a better society. But what happens when the we is actually the powerful interests who have no interest in fixing or solving the problems at all? How long will things remain unsolved, and what will the consequences be? So I don't think Pinker has a very good answer to these problems here. I think he ultimately rests on a kind of faith that eventually these problems will be solved. But I think this faith is looking increasingly wanting. Certainly you have people on the political right, for example, turn into populist and nationalist movements. You have people on the political left turn into more radical forms of socialism, communism, and social justice, all of which don't have hope in our current governmental systems. Another way of putting this is the theorist Troy Deening has said that we live more in a liberalocracy than a liberal society anymore. Conspiracy theories have recently been added into the mix. Another symptom of the fact that we have this very unequal political landscape dominated by this sort of combination of powerful forces and widespread misinformation. It's an extremely confusing and unstable time. It's something we haven't really seen before. So I think a more stable form of progress when it comes to really protecting, looking after our democratic systems would be one in which this continuous economic growth that we're making, which Pinker is a real advocate of, isn't being captured by a small amount of wealthy corporations and oligarchs. Now, I admit that there's very little incentive in the same way that we discussed before for the people in power to make a more equal society rather than to keep things as they are. There's very little incentive, for example, to regulate social media or regulate political donations or indeed tax havens. But it's important to note that these changes are still possible. There's a huge difference between the US and Scandinavian nations when it comes to levels of equality, or even Japan for that matter. The problem with Pinker, I think, is that he doesn't really want to go there. He, again, has this faith. He trusts that eventually human ingenuity will save the day. As long as we don't mess with innovation and campaigning and problem solving too much, we will solve these problems. And he may be right in this. He may be right in the same issues when it came to global food production or health or climate change. But the thing is whether that's actually worth the risk. And personally, I'm not sure it is. I don't want to live in a political system where a small group of people dictate both the information that I'm exposed to and the decisions that are made. That sounds more like an autocracy than a democracy to me. And unless we do something to curb this mass concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, I think that is where we're very likely to end up. Or indeed, a more sobering thought, that is maybe where we already are.